So I'm here to talk to you about automation and artisanship. But first, I do want to say what a great conference so far. We're coming up on the end of the first day. You've got a bunch of new information in your head. We just had an amazing talk from a bunch of kids. It was really entertaining. The sun is shining outside for those of you who've gotten an opportunity to go outside. How's everybody doing? Everybody doing good? Good? All right, now I want to really ask, how's everybody doing? We spent a lot of time today talking about all the things we should be doing, all the things that would be great if we were doing, we've also been talking about all the ways that in our profession, we don't necessarily get treated like humans. We talk about these processes that don't really treat us very well, that are frustrating and painful and hard to solve. And so I just wanted to sit here and stop and say, we're at a conference with a bunch of like-minded peers who all do the same things. We all love each other. We all appreciate each other. Thank you for what you do. As a side note, this is a conference for you. It's one of the things I love about how Jason has created this. If you need permission to close your laptop, I can do that for you. I give you all permission to close your laptops and just sit and listen. It's part of the point of this conference, so please do so. A little bit about me. I'm Kenny Johnston. I'm super excited to be here. Giving a talk at Monitorama is actually on my bucket list. I've had a mentor at a previous job who always religiously came to this conference the last 3 or 4 years and told me if I ever had the opportunity, I should come. This is my first time here, and to be speaking on it is a huge honor. This topic that I'm going to talk about, automation and artisanship, is one that kind of permeates different aspects of my life. I'll speak about those as we go, but it's something I've been super interested in. There's a little bit of a tension between those two words that I think is really important, especially to those of us who practice in the operations world. A bunch of the credits for this go to my lovely partner, the amazing teams I've worked with, a book called Drive by Daniel Pink that I don't know if many of you are familiar with, and the countless Monitorama presentations I've watched over the past years. I hail from Kansas City. I'm an engineer by education, a product manager by trade, and a learner by spirit. I had a first career working in political campaigns, which is interesting, kind of a weird tangent for me, coming from an engineering background. But the experience taught me a lot about what motivates people. And then I had a second career working in open source technology, which taught me about how do we build these kind of collaborative systems that rely on that motivation of what motivates people to get complex tasks done. I now work in product management. I'm a product manager at GitLab, where we have this ambitious goal of bringing the kind of SRE-style DevOps that we're learning about here to the masses. How many people work in an organization with over 1,000, I don't like the word developers, but people who can create software? That's a lot. How many work in over 500, or less than 500, let's say? Less than 100? Less than 50? There's a lot more organizations that have less than 50 than there are over 1,000. And it's important to keep in mind that the principles we're talking about need to also apply to them. So let's get started. We're here in Portland, the rhetorical question. I'm giving an observability talk that uses the word artisans. I would love to know, anybody know other names, other nicknames for Portland?
Rip City.
Rip City? That's not even one I had on my list, man. Rose City, I had that one. For Stumptown, yeah. City of Bridges, I've heard that one. Beervana, I've heard. I don't know if that's a common one around here. I would argue, I have this mental image in my head, I know a lot of people who live in Portland, that everyone who lives in Portland also has to have some like artisanal hobby. Like, yeah, I work at such and such software company, but by night I make artisanal pickles or something like that. You know, it just seems to be something about Portland. So I would argue that Portland could be called Artisanville. So it's not a crazy argument. Portland is known for supporting its artisans. It's known for supporting its local small business. Lots of people say that that is part of what gives Portland its quirkiness, is that it's constantly supporting the kind of like small local business here. You know, at the meta level, today's economy is kind of beset with automation and globalization and the kind of like commoditization of the tasks that we do and the products that we create. But when we look forward, lots of economists, not much smarter than me, talk about how this idea of artisanship and kind of local handcraftedness is going to be what drives local economies in the future as things become more globalized. The famous article is "Don't Mock the Pickle Maker," that the pickle maker is actually going to be the one who drives our economies in the future. Portland isn't just local. It was local before anyone else. Sorry, Brooklyn. I know there's probably some Brooklynites in the house. They are so far ahead of the rest of us, in Portland, in City Hall, they are growing Swiss chard. That's not a lie. So beyond Swiss chard and pickles, here are some of the artisanal things you can pick up in Portland. It's funny, I went to Whole Foods, obviously Whole Foods has lots of artisanal things. And so just a couple hours ago, I took some of these other pictures of artisan things, beer, cooking by artisanal cookies by the pound. The one that I wanted to highlight, the gentleman in this picture, is from Portland Razor Company. Think about that. They make handcrafted straight razors. Now, straight razors, that, in my mind, is the ultimate commodity. You can literally buy a razor with 8 of them in it. But we also have handcrafted artisanal ones. I found that very striking. I also just assumed that people from Portland didn't shave, so it was kind of strange for me. So let's talk about artisanship. So officially defined as a worker in a skilled trade, especially one that involves making things by hand. There's a Japanese word for artisan called shokunin. I'm probably butchering that, so apologies. And as part of mastering their trade, they also honor their tools. Yearly and on New Year's, they honor their tools to give thanks for the abilities that they provide them. Not entirely dissimilar from the bear traps. Teaching your kids about bear traps, we just heard about that. As artisans, we take pride in our work and honor our tools. Now, what is it that drives this artisanal mindset? Is anyone here familiar with the book I mentioned, Drive, by Daniel Pink? Couple? Cool. So for those of you who are familiar, you'll recognize that when we talk about artisanship, the word, the motivator that Pink describes is mastery. It kind of comes to mind. For those unfamiliar, it's a pretty simple premise that is largely targeted towards management and management structures, but it highlights that in the academic management world, we think about carrots and sticks. But actually, there are many famous experiments that show that for right-brained activities, things that require expansive kind of cognitive thinking, that they actually respond poorly to extrinsic motivators. So what does that actually mean? The common experiment is something called the candle experiment, and it showed that if you're performing a task that requires even rudimentary cognitive skills, you will perform worse when given an external incentive. Think about that. If I tell you to do something that requires your kind of like deep thought and knowledge, and say I'll pay you $100, you will do worse on average as a group than people who are not given that incentive. Daniel Pink goes on in his book to highlight that there are intrinsic motivators that actually drive us, and that those motivators are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Let's keep that in mind when we think about the tasks that we're going to ask each of our team members and the systems we're going to build that ask our team members to perform tasks. Let's keep that in mind. Okay, so time for a pivot. I'm going to use this horrible, create a slide that says pivot when I pivot, so I guess I apologize in advance. What's the opposite of artisanship? Also a rhetorical question, automation's point of the talk. And I want to be clear, automation, and I'm not talking about the creation of automation, because the creation of automation does require this kind of skill and can have a sense of mastery. But it is by itself contractive, right? By creating automation, you're creating rigid structures that are contractive in thinking. They don't require skill, no mastery, and despite it having a similar spelling, there's actually no autonomy in automation. So while often very sophisticated, and I think this is an important point, while there is a lot of sophistication and we talk about this in SRE world about building platforms, when there's a lot of sophistication in the platform that you build to enable automation, that actually becomes a commodity. Like all things software, and all things in other places where we've built automation, those slowly become commodities. The electricity or the assembly line, when they first came out, they would have been differentiators and highly valuable to the companies that invented them, but they slowly became commodities. So the automation that we create and the platforms we create become commoditized. How do artisans respond to automation? So, obviously, from the perspective of mastery and purpose, it doesn't require any mastery. It doesn't have a lot of purpose. Even in instances where it is highly purposeful, it's really important that you push this button, it still does not give you the extrinsic motivator that you're looking for. An interesting aside, I'd like to talk about people who particularly dislike this. So architects is an example that comes to mind immediately. There's an art to the engineering function that they do. Mechanics, If you gave anybody here a car mechanic? No car mechanics? If you gave a car mechanic a guide that's like, here's exactly what you do to diagnose a car issue, and just follow these instructions, and then it'll be perfect, they'd throw that thing in the trash in a heartbeat. I'm a big NPR fan, Click and Clack, the Tappert brothers. That's why they have their show, because there is no guide for how to fix cars. Doctors is another one, and so I have this interesting story. My spouse works in hospital administration, creating best practices alongside doctors to become the next new standard even just within her local hospital network. You would be amazed at how resistant doctors are, even when they take part in creating the best practices, how resistant they are to actually using them in practice on a daily basis. This speaks to this sense of mastery. They're constantly pushing back on, yes, I know that I said that was the best practice, but I have the best judgment in this moment. I'm not using these examples to deride the mastery either. I want to make sure that's really clear. The idea of wanting to have your own mastery and purpose is critical for us to move forward. We can't just say, well, get over it, you just need to be the button pusher. That's not how human beings operate. There's this interesting story from a DevOps team member that I worked with who said, you know what, we've got all these scripts, I'm not going to use those automation scripts. These are complex problems that require sophisticated skills, and they describe themselves, I am an artisanal mechanic, and I'm going to figure this out myself. Anybody else heard of a similar phrase in their organizations? It's very common. So it turns out, even us in this very highly deterministic software operations world need some mastery and purpose in our daily life. My talk is going to narrow down specifically to a type of automation, but there are many types. I'm only going to talk about runbooks, but there are others, scripts, monitoring alerts, process documentation, cron jobs. We're going to talk about runbooks specifically. So runbooks have been around for a while. They're typically, especially in the pre-DevOps world, we're relegated to kind of like the purely operations world. People in the development environments didn't even know what a runbook was or how to use it or have any idea. Stuff was thrown over the wall. But we've matured. Runbooks have certainly matured. It's now super common for runbooks to be checked into the same repository as where the application lives. Super common for those runbooks to start becoming more, let's call them automated or executable, so that you can get stuff directly in line with your documentation. Very common for a runbook to be written before an application hits production. Think about that. Those are amazing best practices that we should continue to follow. Next pivot. This image, the statue behind this, in this image in the background, is a statue from Dusseldorf. It is meant to represent conflict. It's meant to represent, there was a 1960s student movement in West Germany against the then conservative government, and this was showing the kind of like old versus new. And the thing that I always recognize when I see this photo is the faces. Their faces are clearly talking past each other. There's no common understanding. And so I am genuinely interested in kind of like how we identify in our personas. So who here considers themselves an automator? They're here to come up with creative solutions and, if they could, automate themselves out of a job. Okay. And who considers themselves an artisan? You're here to take pride in that special crafted solutions you find. Maybe? No? Who's somewhere in the middle? Who says there's a bunch of gray there? I think that's right. So I think that's what I'd like to explore, that conflict. Okay, so slide one. It's a picture of a book burning. We'll call the artisans the automation burners. There's the line from this. There's a picture representing a portion of the New Testament. It says that those who had practiced magic arts brought their books together to burn them. So runbooks are the magic art. Burn them. Leave us to our mastery. Side two is another Bible we all know about, the Google SRE manual. The Google SRE manual clearly states that the black magic is actually everything that is not automation. That we should be out to automate everything, that we should automate ourselves out of a job, that anything requires a human touch, we should crush it. Now, I will point out, the very smart folks at Google have a little often overlooked paragraph in this chapter about automation from the SRE manual that says that they have intentionally stated the maximalist view, that in general, they have chosen to create platforms or automation, but they always feel like they're in the position where they could create those platforms over time. think this is the interesting part, could create platforms over time. We don't really have a system by which we do that. Today it feels very maximalist. It feels like your job is to just go forth and crush all manual tasks. That's really hard to do. I mean, it's hard to get started on it. It's a thing that has an immediate mental blocker, especially for small teams who don't have a dedicated SRE on staff. Think about that. We oftentimes, and I think I saw when one of the talks that was just given, they were asking about cost optimization. And one of the questions in the channel was, how do you get started with a cost optimization team? Lots of teams don't even have the ability to get started on that. That's not even a question. It's like, how can I give a tenth of one person's time to maybe possibly think about cost optimization? So I think it's this lack of depth in understanding how we get started and how that process happens that is really causing the SRE style models that a lot of us use in practice today from becoming used by the rest of the smaller organizations that don't have massive staffs. I'm going to give an example. Put yourself in the shoes of Beatrice. She's a DevOps engineer. She's working on a small application that surfaces a list of artisans in Portland, let's say. They're trying to find product market fit, getting advertisers, trying to build a platform, trying to build an application, but not building a platform. They probably don't have a robust observability system. They probably only have a couple of runbooks that are just the basis for starting some sort of diagnostics. I bet in most instances they started on a NoOps platform, so they didn't have a bunch of operational experience. They were using some sort of past platform that kind of got the application off the ground without having to do a bunch of operations. And so the gap to create a platform at any stage in this life cycle is huge. It turns out that even in, think about that, I guess the example I'm giving is also a greenfield one, right? This picture of a greenfield. It turns out that even if you're starting in greenfield, you're using immutable infrastructure, you're keeping your runbooks in code, it's still really hard to build the kind of model that we're talking about when you have a bunch of other competing pressures. So unless you're a Silicon Valley unicorn with this huge availability of investment or large teams, it's really hard to get started. As a side note, I mentioned this is a picture of a greenfield. This is Van Gogh. Is regarded as one of Van Gogh's least mentally conflicted. He's known for being very having a bunch of conflict in the painting. I think of Starry Night. And so it's called Greenfields, obviously. But it was written while he was at a mental institution. So we've talked about conflict. Let's keep the argument going. I'm sure there's a bunch of music hipsters. We've already been arguing about our 80s playlist. Anybody here consider themselves a music hipster? You can admit it. Let's argue about who discovered bands before their time. It's a time-honored tradition amongst music hipsters. Anybody discover a band way before anybody else did? Anyone want to admit to it? I'll admit to it. Mine is The Cure. The sad, sad Cure. Actually, no, it's not. I'm probably too young for having discovered The Cure. But it is an interesting pivot and a cheap one because that picture is The Cure, and now I'm going to talk about from the conflict to The Cure to our conflict. That was a horrible pivot, I admit. You can add it to the Slack channel. I'll take it. So what do we need in a cure? Let's think about that. Obviously, we need some balance. We need to find a place where we can satisfy people's mastery while also giving progressive steps towards automation. We need something that is both lovable in its kind of intrinsic sense, and also efficient in its extrinsic sense. So this process needs to both tackle the kind of rapid pace of growth in greenfield and the constrained resources of brownfield environments. And it needs to work not just at large, massive cloud scale, but also in small DevOps teams of 2 or 3. So here's my proposal, and pardon the name. I'm going to call it Runbook Zero. It's not a great name. It's the best I could come up with. You've heard of Inbox Zero. Anyone heard of Inbox Zero? Getting stuff done topic. It's super popular. I'm a big fan. I use it every day. Runbook Zero is not going to be like Inbox Zero. I'm not saying just crush your runbooks down to 0. What I'm saying is that there's a couple of principles in Inbox Zero that I think apply to what we're trying to do here. And those principles are, first, completeness. In Inbox Zero, you take everything in your inbox and wipe it down. Prioritization, you are asked to make quick prioritization decisions and bucketize things. And then lastly, kind of like an iterative process, so a rigid process that takes you going forward in in inbox zero. It's really about creating habits that you do this multiple times a day. So my proposal for Runbook zero relies on those same principles: completeness, prioritization, and rigidity. Okay, principle one, completeness. We already version control next to everything, right? We have infrastructure as code. There's places that are defining CI/CD process, their whole CI/CD pipeline in code. You're probably here this week to learn about how you can build your observability system as code, define your observability system as code. It's common for runbooks to live in this same source. And so, like I'd mentioned before, there are now times where we're creating runbooks prior to the application entering production in the first time. Runbooks take these forms of both markdown files and more executable kind of Jupyter-style notebooks are becoming more common. And operational scripts are checked in and used frequently. But I do think that there is one thing missing to this kind of capture everything. And that is actually that we don't instrument the usage of our response tools. I'm going to go a little bit outside of runbooks, but how many organizations actually instrument how often a runbook was used, or how often an automation script was run? Those are important pieces of information that we kind of leave on the wayside. It also is important information for the next step in this process that is going to be really important, and that is prioritization. So I'm a product manager by trade, obviously. It's self-serving for me to say that prioritization decisions are the hardest decisions in an organization. But I do think that's true, especially here when we talk about how to improve our observability and manageability systems. Without data, prioritization is not only hard, but misleading. It's a very common pattern in product management to say, well, we can prioritize X. We should categorize something that needs to be prioritized based on whether we have enough data to prioritize it. There's lots of instances where you actually don't know enough information to know whether or not it should be a high or low priority. And that we often, in those instances, just push them to the wayside. That, oh, well, we don't know enough information, so we'll just not consider it. And so having data, and in the past slide, instrumenting your response systems, help you make those prioritization calls. Now, the way to think about how to prioritize here is also to bucket those mechanisms and levels of automation. You can think about simply, is it a written runbook or is it an automation script? Just like move them between those two buckets. Think about incremental steps to move between those two buckets. It's also important, I don't want you to walk away thinking that prioritization is just based on usage, right? There's a whole bunch of other factors like risk, like time spent in actually implementation that go into prioritization. But having the instrumentation is a missing step that we don't do today. Obviously, if I were to tell you that there's a super high risk process that takes 2 hours of your team members' time and you've been running it 10 times every month for the last 4 months, you would think that would be a high candidate for prioritization. But I'll also say there's a flip side to that prioritization. Let's say, it's very tempting that for us as professionals to say, well, we're out to automate everything. I'm just going to pick whatever is easiest for me to automate and go do it. But we oftentimes choose things to automate that weren't as valuable to automate. What if you automated something and that automation never ran for a year? What was the value of that automation? What could you have done instead of that you chose not to? The last one is the kind of process part of this. So starting from scratch is really difficult. But starting from somewhere is the kind of critical step. I work at GitLab. We are a highly iterative company. Another company I admire, Victor Ops, coined this term, minimally viable runbook. Super important. I love this term. It's really important to think about taking incremental steps because the alternative of doing everything is huge. And that alone is a blocker to even getting started. So think about how we can take small iterative steps that improve on a minimal runbook and then take decisive steps to when we should automate based on data that we know that it is the most important thing to automate at the time. I will say that I think Nita talked about this earlier. It's really also important that when you're thinking about, this can feel very contractive thinking, like all we're doing is making a strict prioritization decision. When you're thinking of ideas of what's next steps to do, that's when you need to think expansively. In that post-mortem process, think about all the possible things and think about the underlying issues that could happen. But then when confronted with, here's a list of possible next steps, be very diligent about which one is the highest priority. Let's go back to Beatrice. She's got her listing of local Portland artisans. Her team has instrumented the response systems they use so that they've categorized which tasks are manual, which ones are zero-touch automation. They have an iteration cycle after postmortems where that information gets reviewed. They make strict prioritization decisions about minimal viable steps towards automation. They can do this without having a dedicated SRE on staff. You obviously have to prioritize that against a whole bunch of other tasks, but it's important to incrementally build that response system over time. Now, the principles of Runbooks Zero that I outlined, instrumenting your systems, prioritizing incremental improvements, that all sounds vaguely familiar. To me, it's familiar. It sounds familiar because it is familiar. I target this, and maybe this is just I work at a DevOps-focused company, so everything is a hammer or a nail or whichever one it is. But I think what we're describing is this kind of blurry area in the response part of the DevOps loop. It's really easy to think about how we do that from a features perspective. From a features perspective, we get feedback from users, and then we prioritize that, and then we go through the next DevOps cycle. We think about how we do that from a security perspective now. We're starting to build DevSecOps tools that allow us to get information about what security issues are highest priority and then drive those back through the loop. But we haven't yet figured out, or at least talked about, how to do that for observability systems. And it does require instrumentation in order to get better data. And it does require a process that enables even small teams to start building these systems over time. And I think that that is exactly what Runbooks Zero gives you. So in kind of wrapping up, artisanship and automation do appear at odds, but I think it's important to focus on the balance, and that as humans, we have to get value from the process. And the process of just saying, go rigidly do something, go rigidly automate, doesn't give us the flexibility to say, no, this is a place where I am going to be artisanal, where I'm going to remain non-automated. And by thinking about incremental improvements, we can actually build this capability even without having dedicated teams of 5 to 20 to keep our applications running. I'll say as observability professionals, we've had the luxury of thinking about and building these applications at scale, but I think it's really important to also build our practices so that they're applicable to even smaller teams. And I believe Runbooks Zero is a way to get there. And lastly, I would say, I do think when it comes to the balance between automation and artisanship, I do think everyone is an artisan in our own way. All of us are knowledge workers. We do great complex tasks. We should never boil ourselves down to thinking about only how we automate things or that the tasks we do are easily automated. And that you are artisans in your hearts, and that despite this kind of like ongoing pursuit to automation, we should always keep that in mind. Thank you, and thank you for your time today. And I appreciate it. And before I leave, I will say this is the first time I've given this talk. I put the channel up there. I would love to get feedback about the talk from all of you. So thank you.